And as I will discuss later, this attitude would be exported to China, Korea, Taiwan, Russia, and Southeast Asia. Those countries have plentiful examples in the field of pornography, but this material is obscure and scarcely known. While contemporary and pre-modern pornography have attracted attention, the modern history has been almost forgotten. In fact, it has been considered worthless by many today. However, is it really so worthless? Images of the naked body, which have lost the eroticism and radicalism of that time, change into the state showing human nature and political conditions, which is worth to be studied. Let's move to part 2, Birth of Nude, Art and Pornography in Asia. I'll start with pre-modern pornography in Asia. In the words of Kenneth Clark, nude means, it is frequently said traditionally there was no nude in Asia. In the words of Kenneth Clark, nude means an ideal human body utilized for observation in art. Meanwhile, naked means to be deprived of our clothes, and the word implies some of the embarrassment most of us feel in that condition. Clark discussed the nude as the very essence of Western art. Clark's point is still relevant today, even though he had entirely omitted the matters of pornography. Looking at pre-modern Asian pornographic paintings from 16th century to 18th century, those works are graceful and delicately drawn. But the bodies are formless, neither clearly stylized nor anatomically accurate. The French philosopher François Julian wrote, "The nude, notwithstanding the delicacy of the drawing, holds no interest in pre-modern Asia." The image on the left is a woodblock print from the series The Pillow Book by Kitagawa Utamaro from 1788. The image in the middle is from an erotic scroll by Korean painter Shin Yun-bok, circa 1800. The image on the right is an untitled work by Chinese painter Kui Yan from the 16th century. Compare these three erotic pictures of Japan, Korea, and China. As Clark expressed, although each culture attracts, Japanese shunga may be exceptional for its dynamic expression. Here I will show modern art history as pornography history. Generally, art historians have tended to interpret art separately from pornography in modern Asia. So the birth of the nude, the same as the acceptance of the nude of Western culture, is called the beginning of modern art. But it was also the beginning of pornography. The image on the left is Morning Toilet by Kuroda Seiki from 1893, which was lost in 1945. Kuroda was the pioneer of the nude painting in Japan. He studied in Paris and returned to Japan in 1893. Then he displayed this work at the fourth domestic industrial exposition in Kyoto in 1895. A number of complaints arose. The public felt uncomfortable with nude painting in a space dedicated to the fine arts and asked for its removal. The image on the right is by George Bigot, satirizing the debate over the female nude by Kuroda. In the end, the painting was not removed from display. The episode shows how Asian people were not accustomed to nude painting. But the real matter is why the nude was considered as too erotic and dangerous and needing to be concealed from public. The nude was dangerous as same as social thought. Kuroda's nude painting of 1901 was displayed half-covered at the 6th show of Hakubakai Society. The police came and enforced a loincloth around the nude painting. Like this. It is said that one of the reasons for the opposition against displaying paintings of nudes ironically involved the kind of social structures established by the government. It tried to appear to rest as a modern nation state. After all, in 1873, it was the government who prohibited public nudity. However, it is important to note that the government prohibited social thoughts as well as nudity. Both the nude and social thoughts were considered evil for society. Nudes in art had different meanings then. What you are seeing now was not simply art at that time. After this incident, genitals were concealed by clothes in pictures in Japan and Korea. In 1910, Korea was annexed to Japan. The painter Kim Guan-ho has studied at Tokyo School of Fine Arts and graduated with the first prize for his work, Sunset, in 1916, and received a special prize in the government-sponsored exhibition in Tokyo. This work was the first time a Korean had painted a Korean nude. It was a big news in Korea, but the reproduction of the work was not allowed to be published in the Korean newspapers. The reason was that it was too risky and might provoke a fever of public immorality. So nudes in Korea were allowed to only 2 persons who had a special interest in art. In 1923, Kim Guan-ho displayed Lakeside at the Chosun Art Exhibition in Seoul. Just as previously, this work was not allowed to be reproduced in the catalog and newspapers. You can see a loincloth between the legs of the nude. This was derived from the Japanese custom after Kuroda. Also, the pose of the nude seen here is close to Kuroda's. Moreover, the back side of the nude on the left image also have come from Kuroda. It was useful in avoiding the accusation painting a nude. This monitor to Kim Guan. In China, the pioneering painter Xu Beihong painted bathing in 1924 when he studied in Paris. This work has recently become well known because it was sold at very high price in a 2006 auction in China. Chinese nude oil paintings before 1930s are so rare now that recently a forgery of a nude by Xu Beihong was sold at a very high price at auction. In any case, this work was not displayed in public. The situation of nude painting was even harder in China than in Japan and Korea. In China, nude painting was severely kept inside art schools until the mid-1920s. In 1920s, Shanghai Art School of Art began to use female nude models. It was the first time in China, but people launched a withering attack on the school, and the dean of the school was almost arrested. Let's move to part 3, image for sale, portraits of prostitutes. As I said previously, the exhibition Splendor and Misery in Museum d'Orsay in 2015 clarified the important role of prostitutes in 19th century French art. Meanwhile, in modern Asian art, the role of prostitutes is also important, even though it may be more limited than France. The defining difference was that the system of prostitution changed drastically in modern Asia. With regard to Japanese geisha and Korean kisen, the border between prostitutes and women who have mastered the traditional arts of entertainment had long been obscure. In modern Japan, the role of geisha was fading in the late 19th century. The government changed its control system. In 1900, female geisha were officially allowed to give up their job of their own free will. There were some Christian missionaries campaigning for the abolition of prostitution, and the sexual diseases of gonorrhea was prevalent. The traditional arrangement of geisha and licensed red districts gradually vanished. This affected the Japanese modern art. George Eagles wrote in 1892 that it was so hard to find nude models that he had to hire geisha women. In the context of pornography, Eagles' episode shows that female geisha facing dismal job prospects sought jobs as nude models. Moreover, in this context, the most boring paintings among the Japanese important cultural properties, Kuroda's lakeside, this picture. I don't have this picture, but this picture will become an interesting one. This model was a geisha who later became his wife. She lived in a time of change from old feudal world to new westernized world, and she was purified by her future husband. The boring flatness and brightness of this painting can be thought as concealing the darkness of tradition in the old time. In short, it was a fight against pornography. Portraits of geisha disappeared from oil painting during the early 20th century, but in the 1930s, explicit eroticism in publishing was banned due to the war. Even so, during time, the old form of geisha's eroticism was resurrected under the guise of studies of folklore or old literature. Books on the geisha districts were frequently published and banned in the 1930s because of the fear of corruption of public morals. When the nude had been almost completely prohibited, the implication of prostitution was sufficiently erotic. Among the books on geisha, Bokto Kitan was a renowned novelist. Bokto Kitan by the renowned novelist Nagai Kafu stands out. Kimura Sohachi's monochrome drawing for the novel was also considered erotic. Here, dangerous eroticism was not in the naked body, but in the old-fashioned emotions aroused by kimono. In Korea, the situation of prostitutes was more complex. The traditional system of kisen had already collapsed before the annexation of Japan. And in the period of Empire Japan, operators of Japanese prostitutes came to Korea to run new brothels in their own style. It was an export of prostitutes from Japan. Yuasa Ichiro painted a Korean woman in 1930 to 1940. It is said to be the first oil painting depicted a kisen. But Korean scholars have pointed out that the hairstyle was not traditional Korean, but Japanese, and its necklace was far from traditional one. In the first place, why did Yuasa painted a kisen in underwear? All the oddness of this painting came from the painter's arrival after the annexation and his view of Korean women like this. After this painting, kisen became a popular theme for both Japanese and Korean painters in modern Korea. These women were different from geisha in modern Japan. For Japanese, kisen was seen as sex objects and specific souvenirs. Such colonialism internalized in Koreans, and kisen became a symbol of local color. But among them, Ikuede's wrestling dancer was the most impressive work. The model's colorful clothes flash brightly in the dark look. The viewer looks down on her, but she looks up to the viewers with a significant expression full of dignity. As for China, traditional Chinese courtesans continued until the mid-20th century. Also, little is known after the Communist Party took control the country. Its basic system had not changed so much since Qing dynasty. Here is a photograph of a courtesan circa 1875. She shows small bound feet, but the infamous custom had gradually collapsed after Xinhai Revolution in 1911. And since 1930s, cheaper dress changed into a new style with long sleeves to show their feet more attractive. In 1942, the painter Umehara Ryuzaburo visited Beijing and painted sister seated together. The models were known as prostitutes. In the time, they don't have the bound feet, and their cheaper dress is a new style one. Interestingly, on this painting, the women do not appear erotic. Actually, this is an exceptional work as a portrait of prostitutes. Umehara was interested in such an odious attitude of sisters. We can say this picture shows people's mature urban consciousness, which doesn't easily fear the colonial attitude of foreigners. Let's move to part 4, Naked and the City, Erotic, Grotesque, and Nonsense. Just before the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, the Japanese style painter Ito Seiyu created a photograph of a pregnant woman strung up, based on a wood block print by Tsukioka Yoshitoshi of 1885. The model was his wife. The left image. A few months later, the avant-garde artist Murayama Tomoyoshi and his friends took a photograph titled Dance, which was published in Marvel, August 1924. The former was thought to be pornographic and Ito Seiyu was arrested. The latter was thought to be an artwork. But both pictures show semi-naked bodies upside down. It is just a coincidence. However, I think both show a specific consciousness of the time, which is known as the era of erotic, grotesque, and nonsense. It was a time after the Great Kanto earthquake when people enjoyed these three aspects in the city of Tokyo. Generally, this is considered a cultural phenomenon made by frivolous or like-minded persons. But I'd like to stress that the era was in a severe depression and people fought against inequality. Among the flood of nakedness in the city, there were naked bodies which were used for social revolution. Monosaseo's Charm of Spring from Tokyo Park magazine in 1930 had once been banned by the authorities in a previous issue. Saseo redrew this illustration, but he still had the intention to criticize the bourgeoisie's class-dominant wealth. Yanase Masamu's poster for a proletarian newspaper in 1927 was apparently a propaganda work. In a proletarian movement, artists are compelled to draw male bodies, not female. Then excessively masculine expressions appeared, such as this one. This could be accepted as object to satisfy homosexual people. While Japan was in the era of erotic grotesque and nonsense, there were very few news published in Korea. According to the scholar E. Kim-yong, in Korea, pornography was almost entirely imported from Japan. At least Korea did not make or publish pornographic images officially during the Japanese occupation. Although nude photos were taken in private, Japanese pornographic picture books under the cover of science or art prevailed. Such books do not survive, but one can find advertisements in newspapers from 1920s to 1930s. After the late 1930s, censorship became strict as in Japan. In my research, I have uncovered a pornographic photo in Korea. It was in a book by a sexologist, Takahashi Tetsu. The picture was overlaid with a cartoon, so we cannot see it in full. However, I think the important point of this picture is not the figure's genital organs, but their faces and gazes. Even though the picture was made to provoke sexual desire, the faces of the couple expresses melancholy and suffering. And who on earth made love with a cap on one's head? It could be said this is a representation of the victims of colonialism. Looking at the situation in the Republic of China, Shanghai enjoyed prosperity during the 1920s to 1930s. Magazines for young intellectual people, such as Shanghai Cartoon and Young Companion, were the stage for progressive artists. And in this period, posters in Shanghai style are renowned. According to the historian Lin Pan, these were made for commercial consumption and represent the new life there. The women in the posters were dressed in the styles of the day. Among the artists representing fashion, Han Ziyin was the most prominent. In an advertising poster, a girl in a canoe is pictured while slightly revealing one breast. However, after the Communist Party dominated such pornography, after the Communist Party dominated this country, such pornographic representation was banned and was replaced by dramatic posters. Also in Manchuria, big cities enjoyed prosperity. This area bordering Russia was occupied by Japanese army in 1932. In Harbin, one of the largest cities of Manchuria, cabaret clubs held strip shows featuring Russian dancers. There was also the projection of blue films. At that time, many Japanese men had a fantasy of sexual intercourse with white women. According to Shimokawa Koshi, on schoolholics from Japan to Manchuria, schoolboys bought nude photos as souvenirs. But looking at nude photos, one can find multiple feelings of pride and anxiety expressed through the models' bodies. They didn't sell their bodies so simply. Let's move to part 5, over the battlefield, war and pornography. The unstable situation in China caused illustrators to draw female nudes with an anti-colonial attitude. Through the nudes, people could feel that they were on the battlefield, not in the land of prosperity. Among them, Ye Xiangyu depicted serpent and beauty in Shanghai cartoon in 1928. This picture criticized wealthy, powerful people who were collaborating with the army. This year was the foundation of the Republic of China, and there was no single ruling power in the country. In the magazine, Young Companion of 1933, there was an image of a white woman, a female nude holding a Chinese sword entitled Heroine. According to the art historian Zen'ei, this image implied resistance against Japanese invasion and the Communist Party as implied in its title. Jan discussed the complicated ambivalences of strength and weakness of the heroine, as the viewer can negotiate multifaceted, multi-layered, and sometimes conflicting meanings. Female nude illustrations were not just about sexual consumption, but also a site of multiple discourse of fantasy and public anxiety. On the real battlefield, Japanese soldiers possessed erotic postcards. Since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, nude photographs enclosed in soldiers' comfort bags were sent to soldiers. This initiative was led by the government and continued until the breakdown of the Pacific War in 1941. The custom was banned by the authorities because of sober-sided ideologies. Meanwhile, in the Pacific War, U.S. Army planes decorated with female nude paintings aided Japan. The painting was called nose art, which was developed as an official sign for identifying friendly units. I can say that female nudes flew over the battlefield of modern Asia. The female nude was used as a variant of psychological attack operation to disturb enemy soldiers. Pornographic leaflets were distributed on the battlefield of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Aside from the actual effects, pornographic images were an important part of military tactics. The U.S. Army also made leaflets written in Japanese. There are two contrasting leaflets made by Japan and U.S., both on the same theme of calling for surrender, and both utilizing nude pictures in monochrome, which were thought to appeal to hostile soldiers. The Japanese one uses a white nude sitting up and showing her breast majestically. Meanwhile, the US one uses a woman in kimono, opening one breast like a geisha. Its text in Japanese is, imagine your wife, sister, and daughter looking like this. And on the other side of the leaflet, throw down your weapons and surrender without fight. In addition, for Japanese soldiers, the image appears sentimental. The image appears sentimental or full pathos because of the lack of contrast. These images of women have been made by someone who knew their opponent's culture well. According to John Adachi, War Without Mercy, in the Asia-Pacific War, both sides accelerated racism through the utilization of propaganda images. However, looking at these erotic leaflets made for the battlefield, both sides tried to understand their opponent's sexuality. Pornography sometimes leads us to a strange place of mutual understanding. Incidentally, pornography was not exclusively for heterosexuals. Gay culture also existed in the army. In Japan, much war paintings could be seen as a form of producing homoerotic social culture. Here, I'd like to show some former soldiers who became famous gay illustrators. They didn't have ways to express their feelings during wartime. Even after the war, they had to use aliases to publish their works in gay magazines. They said their war experiences had affected them. One gay illustrator, Tomita Akiro, also known as Sasaoka Sakuji, published a picture book of soldiers in 1972. He liked slightly chubby males. In a bathing scene, many male nudes were depicted fully in the same style. It shows a sort of paradise found in memories. This could be just a fantasy. However, war as simply severity and tragedy might be in fact be a heterosexual fantasy. Sometimes, gay illustrators show us the gender biases within war. Such fantasy in the military can be found in the works of other former soldier gay illustrators. Among them, Okawa Tetsuji's untitled illustration from around 1973 records twisted pain from his army experience. In this picture, you can see a military boot hanging from a naked man's engorged penis. Curious picture. He is hung and beaten by a superior officer as a punishment or an act of bullying. But his face apparently reflects his inner complicated pleasure. There was other former gay artists of the same generation, such as Mishima Go, Funayama Sanshi. The melancholic faces or mood are common to their works, which was different from the buoyancy of the US gay graphic. In this way, the war affected gay artists. They internalized their pain of war like colonialized people. The last two pictures in my lecture are taken from a book on the study of so-called comfort stations and sexual disease in the Japanese Empire. The Japanese army established comfort stations for its soldiers in China and other countries. There was constant violence against women. In the photograph on the left of a naked woman standing by a bed from around 1943. She seems to be smiling slightly, but in reality, there was a Japanese army soldier behind her. She was forced to smile in order to survive. Also in the image on the right, a woman in a cheaper dress is sitting on a Japanese soldier's legs. His face shows how he enjoys this situation, but it shows today nothing but foolishness of Japanese men. Here, I'd like to say these pictures are not just evidence of war crimes of sexual slaves. These images tell more than that. Images of female bodies have changed into something not erotic, which shows us how humanity is foolish and how desire is regulated by time. In conclusion, today I have discussed the history of Asian pornography from 5 perspectives. I previously said that art is a shadow of pornography, or pornography is a shadow of art. I'd like to explain it in this context. It might be difficult to accept the latter part, why art is a shadow of pornography. I think art is based on what pornography shows. You may feel the images I have shown are not as erotic as you expected. Even more, the previous images of women in the comfort stations might be what you don't want to see if you can. What I want to say is that these have become just bodies which embody political conditions and human behaviors. So the study of the history of Asian pornography is to read colonial politics and desire through represented bodies. It leads to awareness of our own desires, which are the foundation, which are the fundamentals of art. And why pornography is a shadow of art might be more understandable. It functions as art. If art is the pursuit of something new, pornography is a pursuit of something old. You can feel eroticism in something absolutely new. And something old is not steady, but always oscillating in the present. The meanings of modern pornography will change in future. Like an old familiar memory, pornography disappears, distorts, and reconstructs itself. It is nothing but the principle of art. Thank you for your kind attention.
Great. Thank you so much. Right. Any comments, questions? Stunned? Yeah.
I'm guessing you know Nick Bornoff's work.
Sorry?
Do you know Pink Samurai written by Nick Bornoff?
Pink Samurai? So I don't know.
Okay, so I've got no question.
Oh.
I think I showed him, I think I missed it.
Oh, sorry.
I own it, and I showed him all my pornographic and gender-related literature, and I misfiled it, so he should have known it. It's my fault.
Okay, I should read it.
I'll tell you later. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so there's no. I was just going to ask your opinion on whether an outsider had got a.
What do you think? What do you think?
It's so long since I saw it. Actually, I mean, I didn't know him in Tokyo, but he's died, hasn't he? Since?
I don't know.
Yeah. It was very thorough, with hands-on research.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember the book. It's it is on the photos of modern period of Japan, erotic photos in Japan.
No, I think it's a general overview of the sex industry,
Okay.
ranging from
Okay.
geishas to porn stars to hostesses, the whole.
Okay, I read it.
Was there another? Yeah.
I think we can see more nude picture paintings in Western countries than Asian countries. What do you think is the difference?
You mean pre-modern or modern?
Or mid-century.
Mid-century.
Yeah.
You mean 1950s?
Could be, yeah.
It is related to the feudal tradition continued in 20th century, and yeah. And maybe that I think the very idea of nude in Western meaning is not totally truly accepted in Asian countries. So even now.
Yeah. What makes that original difference? Or is it related to religion? Or?
Yeah, religion and very long history of Asia and Western, I think. Very long history of from ancient world to contemporary. It is very different from Western and Asian countries history.
Could you say the really fundamental?
Yeah, very fundamental.
Yeah, but also, like, for example, he showed Kuroda's new sitting down with covering up and so on. I mean, that I also studied a bit of that particular conflict. One thing interesting about that is that Kuroda actually went to Paris as a young man, not as an art student. But then while there, he had all these artist students, and then he decided to become artist, and he spent 10 years in Paris. Right? So he didn't have the sort of art issue of nude or not. So it was particularly in the 1880s where nude painting became really sort of salon painting, Brücke and so on, you see. And he brings back that to Japan, and he so now actually spread this Western style painting and nude, so this is the highest form of art. But the police who actually censored it, because in Japan we didn't have a sort of a central police system. Police is a modern institution, and by Edo becoming Tokyo and modernizing, and actually the first sort of head of police went around to Europe to see what kind of policing I want. Works. He didn't like the nice body, and he liked the sort of Prussian and Parisian sort of like citizens like this kind of police, you see, and he introduced that. And then he particularly, also it's interesting, the early modern period in Meiji, you have these bylaws in Tokyo that prohibits nudity. That's because the Western people complained. The Japanese suddenly sort of becomes naked, and then that's really not nice, and so on. And then the police, in order to become modern, that means you can't be nude, so they prohibit, you see. So it's a public nudity rather than sexuality. And so, for example, in the early period, there's also police record. The obscenity punishment record is very steady and not that many. But the public nudity thing first, and then it rises up to like 7,000 or something. I forget the exact. And that's a lot of them who are rickshaw-men. It's hot, so they're just sort of they're running with the rickshaw, which is topless, and then policemen come. You're nude, so you're arrested. You see. So, but then gradually that kind of Western idea of nudity is bad becomes part of the modernization idea. You see, and then so it's both the police censoring the nude painting and the painter trying to show nude are both based on Western ideas rather than traditional. Because I believe also in China, like Confucian ideas of covering up, very much so. And again, in both countries, again, the art academies, they try to paint nude, but then the popular, because popular imagination on sexuality is a really moving feast. It changes every 5 to 10 years, even now. Maria.
Yeah, there are a couple of observations. I think one is nudity in painting is a very different thing to photography, because that's kind of just completely changes it. Two is question of context and time, which, you know, if you think about Asian countries, if I'm thinking about Malik Aluha, he also did a whole kind of series of postcards. He illustrated postcards from Algerian women who knew. And that was as a strategy of the French strategy of kind of humiliating the Algerian women, and I think I can see kind of resemblance in terms of colonialism here. And I think it's probably the whole question that you were asking earlier about what's the difference about the female body and the nudity around the female body, which tends to happen a lot more than the male body, let's say. We could discuss that in terms of kind of patriarchal societies are stronger. I mean, I come from Iran, and I know about censorship and kind of the covering that goes, the other extreme. So that you're talking about a very complex issue here, and in every country, every culture, every time, every moment, whether it's war, whether it's something else, nudity means something completely different. In an exhibition space, nudity within Western country is kind of to do with something completely different issues than it is perhaps if you see it as postcards, which is handed over from one person to another. You see what I mean? This kind of prostitution of the body, the female body. So yeah, sorry, I'm getting that.
I don't actually agree that your difference between photography and
That'd be interesting.
I mean, like non-graphics photos are extremely powerful art.
I don't dispute that. I'm not actually talking about, depends on how it's kind of portrayed, how it's photographed, how it's gazed upon.
Yeah, you say about context, that I agree. Malcolm, you want to?
Just to say, I think Sasha knows why I'm asking this question, but in Japan, has there been an acceptance or a media version of what you could call the Playboy phenomenon, of sanitized pornography or watered down pornography or publicly acceptable quasi-pornographic imagery? I mean, in Playboy have just suddenly decided that they will not show any more nudes, which is interesting because their whole ethos up to now has been introducing the idea of the tasteful nude. So that instead of getting out of pornography, they're actually getting out of taste, but that's a different question. In Japan, has there this, I mean, supposed to make it simple, is the Playboy idea of working with pornography something people understand?
Playboy idea sounds...
Of the kind of diluted or acceptable version of the pornographic image.
What the authorities do is physically abrade the pubic hair. They scrape it, images of pubic hair off the plate of the disease.
It is, in other words, I suppose what I'm saying is, because this idea of shadow, pornography being the shadow of art, or being the shadow, well, the shadow is also the kind of what you might call homeopathic version, the idea of inoculation, that you can be among pornography while not being in it. Is that something that's...
雑誌とかね、ああいう入道を公にあるいはそういうの出すのはね、こっちでだんだんこうチーム引いてんだけど、日本ではどうですか?
In current situation of erotic magazines, in Japan, the situation doesn't change, but there's pressures from people who sympathize with censorship in Western countries. In comic books, it is strictly restricted in representing child porn. It was not prohibited in a few years ago, but recently it was all prohibited. Situation is changing in
But
Japan.
sort of mainly in Tokyo.
Many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's more like it's less complicated. It's the child pornography.
Right.
You see,
Yeah.
and that's very much. And then also, child pornography, like in photos and films, were prohibited anyway, like here. But on particular in comics, it was much more open.
Yeah.
Comics is much more wide, kind of some extreme comics we have. You see. And those are now, and there was a huge, because I was also in the manga history society, and there was a huge discussion, and the Association of Manga Studies, they have actually a lawyer and discussing all the case laws in the journal, and the borderline is again shifting almost every year. But in general, in Japan, it's much more easily available. Nick is right in that the actual depiction of the genitalia and the hair was long time taboo, and it's still mainly taboo, but if you published it in like 300 pounds gorgeous book, then you can show everything.
And that shows that pornography has its own shadow. It doesn't, pornography has its own shadow, it doesn't need art to shadow it. In a sense, the shadow of pornography is the sanitized, diluted,
Yeah, but
or
like,
the expensive version.
yeah, like every convenience store in Japan, you can buy real pornographic magazines.
Yeah.
I mean, everywhere. I mean, it's really much more widely, and every bookshop has it, and it's much more widespread in that sense than here. And also here, there is also the social divide sometimes. So working class men can sort of consume like page 3 cheapo newspapers and magazines, whereas posh people don't, kind of. At least there's this.
It's a class
But in
issue.
Japan, it's just, it's much more easy available.
But to every class, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, so like, I mean, little corner shop will have pornographic magazines.
Kira, what happened to all the pornographic magazines in
The
Japan?
internet. The internet, my dear.
Because I remember when I kind of came in '79, I would
Yeah.
see lots of pornographic
No,
magazines.
they have
everywhere.
gradually
Just
disappeared,
kind of
partly
disappeared.
because nobody buys them, and partly because of I think shopkeepers just didn't like selling them.
You still see shops in top shelf.
Yeah.
But it's always out the way.
Yeah.
You
I
know.
remember, where was it? Yeah.
I think it's becoming, I can't imagine, what it would be like to go and buy one of those in a shop. It would be kind of almost like being old-fashioned or retro, or belonging to a different age.
And also, like, historically, it's interesting, some of the more artistic, like pornographical magazines, manga, comics, were, I mean, I said it's like, I mentioned it at the conference, Brücke conference, that for example, Takemiya, a very famous girls magazine, girls comics, who is now vice chancellor of the university, she wanted to depict on the first page of the comics bed scene with legs entangled.
What?
A bed scene with legs like this, and that's what she wanted to do, right? And she had on a girls magazine, comic magazine, and she knew if it was a boy and a girl, she'd be arrested, and magazine would be forbidden and so on. And she got the idea, if it were 2 boys, I can risk it. And the risk worked. And if you buy that, it's a really famous series of on sort of boys' love in boys' sort of dormitory. And it's a long, real serious story. People die and love and so on. But it's all these beautiful boys. You see? And again, if you open it up, yeah, those legs. You see? And the boys have become now a genre which is mainly consumed by women.
What is it called?
Boys love.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a category.
I see.
Yeah, BL actually it's called.
Can ask you, for sure, to expand on the difference between photography, nudity in photography, and nudity as in illustration and painting, because to me they feel completely different as an observer, as someone who gazes at it. Then they just have.
You have seen the artistic, super early photographs
because you
with
were
Japanese
saying,
ladies washing this.
yeah.
That was sort of more or less like a art souvenir.
Postcard thing, yes.
But it was sort of big photos in photo albums, and the photo albums very often had a sort of lacquer decoration, really gorgeous decoration.
Yes, but you, I don't know, I'm not really expressing myself properly, or to me there is a big difference between a photograph of a nude woman than the illustration or painting of it. You were saying you don't see the...
No, I don't really.
You don't
Sometimes
see, you don't
they do.
I'm not saying
Yeah, I know.
I agree or
That's
don't
what
agree.
it's
I'm
like.
not
You're
saying
thinking of the
there's-
Western new tradition, though.
Yeah,
You're thinking like Kenneth Clark. You're saying it's this tradition of the Western nude in painting, which is a thing in itself. But in a sense, what you're both saying is that doesn't quite apply to the Japanese context.
Yeah, I think it doesn't apply even in the Western context.
Not anymore.
Yeah, why does it feel different for you? Painting or painting?
I don't know, there is something, there is a space, there is a gap, I think. There is a space in when you see a photograph, you almost, yes, this is a human. I recognize myself within a body, I relate to another body.
Oh, I think your idea is
When you see an illustration, I'm sorry, when you see an illustration, there is a gap. There is an imagination, there is kind of a space between me seeing something that is imagined.
so you think it's a filtered thing, yeah?
There is a gap between what you see
Because I know you, so I can be
and how
also
you relate.
defend my
Just a
thing a bit
difference
more
in
radically.
media
Yeah,
that
basically,
applies to any subject.
your premise is that the photo is a realistic reality just copied with no human intervention. Whereas now, photography is just a tool, exactly like a pen or brush, the camera. It looks very lifelike, I agree, but it's still a filtered medium, and you create it, and then it has a frame and composition chosen and so on. So it is not as you imagine. It's just a pure reality. You see? So I think the gap.
Of it. I'm just talking about the surface of something and our perception of it.
But then, say, a super realist painting and photography. So super realist painting is, again, for you, it's a painting and not a photography.
I am not making any judgment. I'm just interested in the difference. I'm not saying.
Yeah, maybe I'm
this
saying
is
that the
better,
difference
that's
isn't
better,
that
this is
big.
more
That's
beautiful,
my
that
point.
isn't. But I'm just saying the way my eyes might touch a photograph. Is,
Well, maybe when I look at the woodblock paint, there is a certain dramatization or distortion when it comes to illustration or drawing. So there might be a different sensation from photography from illustration. Like he was comparing the ukiyo-e paint to Chinese or Korean illustration. Yeah, there was sort of. I saw, yeah, he was talking about the dramatization.
see, that's an illustration. It's an illustration of something that happens. Whereas with photography, you know that, I mean, if there were two people and you took a photograph of that, to me that would be different. It's almost like the image, the imperfection of the illustration itself leaves some gap that photography doesn't.
Still don't agree.
Okay, I'm not really
How about the
I was
others?
really surprised because I thought that's just like a given for everyone. But obviously not. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your
Thank you.
comments.
Sort of moving away from it then.
Yeah.
So it says, you said art is in the shadow of pornography and sort of vice versa. So would you say sort of pornography is still influencing arts today?
Oh yeah, I think so. But I don't know contemporary pornography so much. But as I expressed, the left is the left image. 教一鈴木恭一、教一鈴木 is artist. He was very interested in contemporary, but a bit old pornography. And he found the old VHS videotapes. Now in 21st century, no one used the format. But the lost format was the lost format became a very stimulating resource for current culture, because there are unbelievable situations and very exciting materials. It is no more erotic, but just curious. Curious things. It is one example, and Ayamakoto or I can say as a artist who used pornographic images.
My question might be about do you think is the purpose of pornography is different according to the time and space?
Progress.
The purpose of the pornography. I think for me the pornography seems to be a really particular purpose to
Okay. It is depend on time and space, I think.
It's different.
Yeah, different.
How could you elaborate that?
Yeah, but very different even in one place at the time. It is it is different from people in person. So I don't think. I think it is better to say not to. I can say it is better to think about the the commonness rather than differences of the purpose or the differences, small differences. But I try to think about the history, not in detail, but in total structure. So today I talked like this.
Because your interpretation is quite wide.
Yeah.
Because I know there's some discussion about the difference between erotic art and pornography. Whereas for me, pornography's definition simply as some kind of visual image which arouses. That's my one definition. So it applies to gay or lesbian or homosexual or S&M or whatever. If it is made for purpose for the customer or whoever looks at it to arouse, that is the main purpose. And so also I find very interesting in the East and West discussion, I mean in the West it is changing. That has nothing to do with art. Right? So basically art can arouse. I mean Utamaros is a rich man gave lots of money to create really pornography, but it's great art. And so the Lady Chatterley's case is that people coming and say, that is art, so therefore it is not pornography. That's illogical.
Yes, well, would you like your servants read it? But the point really, I mean, you've just made it yourself. Pornography comes in like food, flavours. Gay, lesbian, S&M, it comes in these varieties, in types, in all, and then you say, oh, I like that one and that one and that. And unless Utamaro spent his days carefully thinking of particular markets for particular kind of, I don't know whether he did or not, whether he was...
No, it's commission.
Okay, right.
It's like the, you know, the one Courbet's genitalia picture, which was the Turkish man commissioned it.
So it's a bit different than what you might call mass market pornography, which is produced in the way that food is produced in varieties.
Well, but mass market is also for the mass to get aroused.
Yeah, but art isn't produced that way. It's not produced in varieties and flavours in the same.
Oh, I don't know about that.
You think? No?
Not quite like pornography.
Well, certainly, I mean, it's sounding a bit canty in here, but surely there's got to be a difference.
Yeah. So I think that definition is interesting.
Yeah.
And again, if you discuss the difference between erotic art and pornography, there's lots of debate on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of feminists who actually use that kind of, the whole kind of like pornography, just showing genitalia and kind of, what was that? I can't remember the woman's name, but she actually, her performances are about opening herself up, getting the audience to go into kind of actually, no, not what she's doing. There is particularly within performance art.
Yeah, but I think very often the performance art who deals with pornography is very often more about the power relationship rather than arousal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, usually those are gruesome rather than erotic.
Yeah.
Did you mean Orlan, the French woman who does the
Orlan.
No, all that, no,
Who
that's
says
not, no, it's
performances
well
and-
before her, but,
Schneemann?
yes, it's,
Caroline Schneemann?
no, I can't, is escaping, but there's a very thin line between all of that, I think.
Yeah, I know.
Just a very thin line.
Well, if you look at someone like John Curran, for example, you might be, again, you have to look at this from the other way and say, obviously he's riffing on artists like Cranach, but also he's producing things that look pretty much like standard pornography.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about his research is that if you want an art history chair in Japan, that is really, he shouldn't do this. But I like this kind of real opening up.
Yeah.
What's done in Japan. Yeah.
I'm sorry if my answer to my question was very obvious. I'm sorry if that was the case. But I was wondering what makes modern pornography modern? Is it, in your lecture, is it merely a periodical thing? Or there was a sort of, I kind of read that your lecture in a way that pornography could be a kind of tactic, as well, a method to execute some certain purpose, or as well, and that could be also, some philosophers call it as a definition of modern as well. And if it was a more sort of periodical thing, is there a postmodern pornography, or because you included some contemporary examples as well, and what makes modern pornography modern?
Good question. You could write a PhD on that.
I'd like to answer the first question. What made pornography modern is the acceptance of Western view. That is very different from the previous pre-modern age and modern age. And it is very interesting. What is postmodern pornography? I like to think in the future. I don't know so far. Thank you.
It is a central question. Lots of people just avoid. Okay, any more questions or provocations? Okay, thank you very much. Please write down your comment sheets.